Good evening. My name is Sean. Welcome to People's University around the world in literature and language. And last week we were in Japan, so we. Good evening. My name is Sean. Welcome to People's University around the world in literature and language. And last week we were in Japan, so we. Good evening. My name is. Well, that's because I had two other windows open with Facebook and forgot to shut them off. Let me start over. Last week we were in Japan, and now this evening we'll be in Serbia with Dr. John Cox leading the tour. And so we'll be learning about a Serbian writer and some of the language and culture as well. Dr. Cox went to Indiana University just like Joe Laker, for whom he worked, at Wheeling Jesuit University, with whom he worked. And he's now in North Dakota, and I'll let him tell you more about that, but he had a good life in Wheeling when he was here, and was married here, and was a history professor. And we are very happy to have him. He's a translator of books. He'll tell you about that as well, and all about the Serbian language and culture. Here's Dr. John Cox.
Thank you, Sean. Hi, everybody. I'm talking to you from my office on the quarantined campus of North Dakotah State University in Fargo. Fargo is a real place. You've seen the movie, you've seen the TV shows, 3 great seasons. It's real, and I'm here. And yes, it is an absolute delight to be doing something else with the Ohio County Public Library. This People's University is an awesome thing. I spoke at the library a couple of times during my 13 years in Wheeling, from 94 to 97. And I used to take my kids there regularly for the children's book hour and stuff on Tuesday mornings, I believe it was. Anyway, life circumstances took my family here, but I have a lot of respect for your public library. And of course, I have many great friends and former students and colleagues from the late great Wheeling Jesuit. So it is, I'm especially grateful to Sean for this opportunity to talk about Serbian literature, because this is a talk that combines my vocation as a historian with my avocation as a literary translator. First of all, just so I can know that all the technology is working well, because I'm a bit of a troglodyte, those of you who have the live comment function on your screens, could you just write in and just say, I can hear you, or I can't hear you, or why am I here, or the fish rots from the head, or something? Maybe some comments will pop in so I'll know that someone's out there. Okay. As Sean said, I am a historian, and I work in the field, the subfield that's called intellectual history. Intellectual history traces the interactions between ideas and individuals and institutions. And one of the sources for intellectual history is texts of any kind. They need not be diplomatic or archival texts. Intellectual historians can work with statues, and we can work with films, and we can work with maps, and we get to work with all kinds of things. Well, I've always liked to work with novels. I think my students from Wheeling Jesuit, and certainly all my students here at North Dakota State, Go Bison, get the idea that I love to work with novels. It's not that novels present accurate history. They can present, though, authentic history in terms of mood, atmosphere, and emotion. Novels can represent certain time periods, give a level of detail that textbooks would labor pointlessly, one might say, to add or to impart. And books are fun. Novels are fun. They get people into the time period in relatively painless ways. So I've always used a lot of novels in my work. I first started teaching at the college level in 1990, back in Bloomington, when I was still a graduate student. And so I am now starting my 31st year of teaching, and I've used a novel, at least one novel, in pretty much every course I've ever taught. So there are lots of ways to use novels in history. We don't have to worry about that tonight. I just wanted to let you know why I, as a historian, am going to talk about literature. So Serbia, former Yugoslavia. 9 times out of 10, when I give a public talk or answer a question or an email query or anything about Serbia, it has to do with the late great Yugoslavia and the breakup of that country, the horrific breakup of that country in the 1990s, with all kinds of lingering diplomatic and refugee and economic pain that goes on to this day. Indeed, I did start my academic career starting in the late 1980s when I went to grad school studying Yugoslavia. Thank you. I'm hearing from lots of you that you are tuned in, and I guess things are working on the technological side. All right, thank you. But we can talk later if you want about why Yugoslavia broke up. But I would like to focus tonight just on Serbia, just on one part of the former Yugoslavia. Ironically, when the country broke up, starting in 1991, completely unexpectedly, I might add, most of us who were in some kind of Yugoslav studies, the country eventually split into 7 different countries, right? 7 different countries. So nobody can study all 7 of those countries. So if you do contemporary history or one of the social sciences, you basically most people picked 2 of the successor states, 2 of the new post-Yugoslav countries. So I picked Serbia and to a lesser extent Slovenia, which is where I spent my time on my Fulbright doing my dissertation research. But okay, why don't we talk first just a little bit about Yugoslavia? But actually, no, pardon me, I'm gonna digress. Not digress. I'm gonna start on a different note. I would like to introduce you via photograph to an incredible writer. This woman's name is Biljana Jovanovic. Yovanovich sounds like a name Americans are familiar with. Biljana, her first name, is not a common name, obviously, in the West. It's very common in the Balkans. She is the Serbian writer about whom I hope to speak most this evening. I have just gotten a contract to translate her 3rd novel into English. I've done novels 1 and 2. Each of these is coming out with a different publisher. Your library has 1 or 2 of these already. I think she is the most incredible writer of the late Tito period, or of the late Yugoslav period. She's not a household name here. I wish she were. She is a household name in Serbia, ironically. But so it's time we caught up with the world and tried to appreciate her a little bit. All right. So hang on 1 second, please. I'm going to try to get this picture of her up. Let's see. All right, Mr. Duffy, there. This is Biljana Jovanovic. She was born in 1953 and she died in 1996, way too early. She had cancer. And Jovanovic this is one of the most frequently posted pictures of her. This is rather iconic because she is standing underneath a road sign with the name Avila on it. Avila is the name of her 2nd novel that I hope to talk about shortly. Sorry, her 1st novel. And it is a mountain south of Belgrade where there are a number of cultural institutions. There's the tomb of the unknown Serbian soldier is there. There are old castles and everything up on this mountain, parks, romantic walkways, restaurants. There's also a sanatorium there, an insane asylum, a mental hospital that plays a key role in a number of her works and actually, sadly, in the lives of some of her family members. So this is a very, very good picture of her. And I think I might show 1 or 2 other photos of Jovanovic. Jovanovic was trained as a philosopher at the University of Belgrade. She started university in 1972. She was the child of a party of prominent Communist Party officials who, during World War II, had been prominent military officers, father and mother. She was from Montenegro originally, the province of Yugoslavia next to Serbia. Today it's an independent country. Jovanovic grew up in Belgrade, however. Her parents, after World War II, came to be part of the new communist government and took positions there, and she was raised in Belgrade with her sister and brother, and studied philosophy, had a huge love of both history and literature, like so many people do. And she began to work for various publishing houses, etc., doing editorial work. But in 1978, she released her first novel. And it was called Avila Is Falling. This is a modern version of it, a reprint. I have an older version that I used to actually do my translations with. Here's the English version that just came out. Avila Is Falling. It's about that mountain that you see in the picture there. What would happen if it crumbled? What would happen to our system of everything from heroes to mental institutions if this great big symbol of power and authority and masculine dominance were to disappear? All right, more on the novel, etc. So Biljana Jovanovic wrote her first novel in 1978, and it became a cult classic. It was reprinted multiple times. It was this Avila Is Falling book. People have told me over and over how when they were high school or college age, very often women made these comments to me. They found this book, they read it in the park, they read it on the bus, they read it at home. Their parents didn't like it because it was kind of a radical book, etc. And everybody was reading it. It was very, very popular. And then 2 years later, she publishes her second book, which is called Dogs and Others. Dogs and Others. This has also been reprinted recently, but this is my old beat up version that I did my translation from. This is what the English version, sorry, there's the camera, what the English version looks like. So this came out in 1980. It was also a tremendous hit and established her as a really, really serious writer. She only wrote one more novel, however, 4 years later in 1984, the novel that I'm working on now. It's called My Soul, My One and Only. And it did not get such great reviews. She didn't care. She was a radical innovator in literature, and she was moving on to other forms and things. But she also, the reason she quit writing novels after 1984 was because she got more and more involved in politics, in alternative oppositional politics. She was a dissident in late Yugoslavia, and then once Slobodan Milosevic took over Serbia, and engineered the breakup of Yugoslavia in all of its tragic dimensions, she became an opponent of Slobodan Milosevic, and she was a peace activist and much more. So I hope we'll have time to talk a little bit more about her career. Today, Serbs remember her primarily as, well, I should say, Serbs remember her both as a writer and as a civil society activist, or as a dissident, or as an oppositional figure. She's often associated with feminist journals and publications and societies in late Yugoslavia and in Serbia, and she proudly proclaimed herself to be a feminist, but she mixed her feminist activity with a great number of other causes. She was active in environmental movements, anti-censorship movements. One of her very first political engagements was in a group that wanted to end the death penalty, wanted to end capital punishment in Yugoslavia. And she becomes an opponent of nationalism and of the wars in ways that sort of outstripped her feminism in terms of how much, also outstripped her literary work in terms of how much time it ate up in her life. Okay, so having established a little bit of who Biljana is, oh, well, okay, one more picture. I'm going to show you one more interesting picture of her. It's pretty small, but we'll see if this can work. This is a picture that her former husband sent me, her widower, her husband, who gives me access to all these works. This is really tiny, so we'll see if it can come up. This is a picture of her in her apartment. she's in a very, very sad mood here. I don't know if you can see this. This was taken in 1993, I believe he said. This is in Belgrade, where she lived all of her adult life. And she is mourning the siege of Sarajevo, which her people, the Serbs, had, as I say, engineered and arranged, and where a great deal of her friends and a great deal of the common cultural legacy of her country was being destroyed, and this cast her into a tremendous depression, according to her husband, and it steeled her resolve to do a great deal of work on the peace movement. Okay, so why don't we talk now about Yugoslavia, or about Serbia and how it emerged from Yugoslavia, just for a few minutes. But how about I stop right now, since we're 15 minutes in, and ask if there are any questions or anything thus far? Am I talking too fast? Okay, well, if you have questions, feel free to send them in. I have a live comment line here on the computer, and I will gladly stop what I'm doing and try to be more clear if you're checking in that way. So it's time for a brief historical survey of what this country Yugoslavia was, because Yugoslavia was kind of the incubator. It was kind of the petri dish out of which the modern country of Serbia emerged. Serbia had been a kingdom, an empire, they called themselves, in the medieval times, but that was not a national state. It was not based on nationality. It was based on dynastic authority, and it was multinational, like all of the empires of the Balkans were. Serbia is taken over by the Ottoman Turks in the 15th century, and then emerges from Ottoman sovereignty gradually over the course of the 19th century, becoming fully independent in 1878. Serbia was then involved in that disastrous way in World War I, and in 1918, at the conclusion of World War I, local authorities in the Balkans, as well as a number of the great powers like the United States, got representatives of a number of the larger national groups in the Western Balkans together and created a new country. It was called originally the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, quickly changed its name to Yugoslavia. And here is a map of, well, not of Yugoslavia, but of what used to be Yugoslavia, or of what Yugoslavia became, pardon me. Okay. Can everybody see this map? Good. These are the countries that, thank you, doing fine. Okay. These are the countries that used to be part of Yugoslavia. Today, this is a contemporary map. These are the 7 countries that exist today on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. Slovenia in the north, member of NATO and the EU today, ironically. Same for Croatia. Bosnia, or Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the middle. Montenegro and Serbia and Macedonia in the south. And the 7th member of the new family of nations, Kosovo, an Albanian, primarily an ethnically Albanian country, right next to another ethnically Albanian country, Albania. Kosovo is not universally recognized. Serbia does not recognize it, and the only reason it exists, according to Serbs, is because NATO and the US basically took it from them in 2008, of course, after they mucked it up for the better part of a century and made a lot of people's lives there miserable. Anyway, Kosovo will probably be more. My maps have improved, says a former student. Wonderful. Uh-oh, now I know I'm being compared to my previous iterations. So this is the former Yugoslavia. Jovanovich's people are from Montenegro, the yellowish country in the south there. Many Montenegrins actually consider themselves Serbs. Today, roughly half Montenegrins consider themselves a separate ethnicity, but they often throughout history had a separate political state anyway, and since 2006 they've been independent of Serbia. But the little red dot above the R in Serbia, that is the capital of Serbia, Belgrade. I was going to show you a few cool pictures of Belgrade since it's the scene of these two Jovanovic novels. Well, first of all, managing if I were there in person, I would do this. I would have made my 4th ever PowerPoint just for y'all because I like Ohio County Public Library that much. But not being quite sure how all this was going to work from 1,000 miles away, I didn't pull up any pictures of Belgrade itself. I can just tell you that it's not the most picturesque city in the world, so you're probably not actually missing that much. There are parts of it that are lovely. The people are fantastic, which is why I keep going back. Belgrade has been bombed a lot of times, and it's they call themselves the Paris of the Balkans, but it doesn't quite look like Paris. Anyway, Belgrade was the capital both of Serbia traditionally and of the unified country of Yugoslavia. It was the biggest city in the Balkans, and Yugoslavia, when it started breaking up in 1991, had about 24 million people, and the Serbs were well over a third. About 40% of the population in this whole country was Serbian. The second largest group were the Croats, and they had about a fifth of the population. Yugoslavia as a country, about 100,000 square miles. And I used to, when I was teaching in Wheeling, I would say that's about the size of Oregon. I remember in graduate school, my teachers told me, I was in Indiana, they would say it's the size of Indiana plus Illinois. Well, I am pleased to share with you now a new metric for gauging the size of the former Yugoslavia. It is almost exactly the size of your state plus my state. It was almost exactly the size of West Virginia plus North Dakota. So not an insignificant chunk of territory, right? Serbia is reasonably big and has a long and distinguished culture, as do all of the other areas. All right, we're going to stop the screen and get back to this. Okay, so what was Yugoslavia? Yugoslavia was this country that existed from 1918 to 1991. Yugoslavia went through a period of extreme trial, extreme crisis, extreme mobilization, anxiety, and bloodletting during World War II. Yugoslavia was invaded by the Axis forces, by the Nazis and the Italians, but also by their minions next door in Hungary and in Bulgaria and even in Albania. Yugoslavia was carved up into a whole bunch of occupied zones, into puppet states, etc. It was a horrific time. The civil war that was unleashed in our lifetimes in the early 1990s was, in many people's minds, an evocation, a repeat, a redux of the war in the 1940s, and sometimes that was actually done by design by some of the leaders in the 1990s to get people ginned up and eager to fight in the same way. Yugoslavia came out, however, of World War II, having sprouted a number of resistance movements to the Nazis and their Axis colleagues. The biggest of these resistance movements was called the Partisans. And this was a group of mostly, not completely communist, but mostly communist guerrilla fighters led by one man named Tito, Josip Broz Tito. I'm going to show you a picture of Tito here because not only was he the military leader of Yugoslavia during World War II, he became president for life, as we joked, until his death in 1980. So Jovanovich's first two books are published in the latter years of the reign of this cat Tito. That's why we call her a late Titoist writer. And I, being a historian primarily, and not primarily a feminist literary critic or anything else like that, or a linguist, I like to see her works in a thematic way and present them in a thematic way as being a kind of critique of life under late Titoism, specifically the violated social contract of life under late Titoism, because the Yugoslav government had stopped delivering the things that had made it legitimate to many people. Here's Tito, our president for life, coming up on the screen here. He looks really grumpy there. This is when he's in his transition phase from military leader to would-be movie star. He was big friends with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton after he quit murdering his own people, which he did quit doing in the early 1950s. He became more and more of sort of a guiding figure, almost grandfatherly, almost, not quite. He got rid of the uniform and just appeared in a suit. He had a yacht and a zoo and a bunch of islands in Dalmatia. He hung out with foreign dignitaries. And yeah, Richard Burton made a movie about the Yugoslav partisans and played Tito. And Tito thought that was pretty cool. He cultivated that relationship. Anyway, that's President for Life Tito. He does not come up in the novels that we will eventually talk about, but it's his system that Yovanovich wanted to tear apart. Okay. There we are again. All right. So this country of Yugoslavia, after World War II, it exists in the same boundaries that it had from its original formulation, but now it's not going to be a monarchy anymore. It's going to be a socialist country, as they called it there. We tended to call them communist countries because it was the Cold War, and it was easier to hate a communist country than try to distinguish the difference between communism and socialism. But Tito in 1948 had a gigantic falling out with Stalin and the Soviet Union. There are 6 or 7 reasons that this happened. We don't need to belabor that point. But let's just say, when you think of the Cold War in Europe and you think of the Iron Curtain, so-called Iron Curtain, you think of the East Bloc, etc., Yugoslavia was not part of all that. Yugoslavia was neutral in the Cold War. They called themselves, yes, everyone fell out with Stalin. Only not everyone got away with it the way Yugoslavia did. The Yugoslavs retained their socialist system, but they created what they called a treći put, a third path. Tito and the guy I wrote my dissertation on, who was his right-hand man, Kardel, and a number of other leaders, including Milovan Djilas, a famous Montenegrin writer and dissident also, they decided they would create a different kind of communism that would not be beholden to Stalin's state capitalism with massive use of secret police and unending human rights violations and crimes, etc. So Tito and Stalin never make up. Tito and Khrushchev, Tito and Brezhnev, they do a certain dance. But Tito is very, very proud of steering Yugoslavia between the blocs. And in the United Nations and elsewhere, the Yugoslavs caucused with a group of other countries called the Non-Aligned Movement. Tito helped found this movement with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, with Nehru, President Nehru of India, with President Nasser of Egypt, and a number of other representatives of the Global South. Yugoslavia was the only European country, only major European country in the non-aligned movement. So Yugoslavia is doing things differently at the international level, but that necessitates lots of changes on the home level too. So if the early emphasis in Yugoslavia was on a rigid system that did sort of, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, there was this rigid emphasis on these 3 elements: the Tito Party and Army. Tito Partia Armia in Serbian. These are the things that were going to bond the members of this war-torn country together and make it possible for them to withstand foreign pressure and make it possible for them to build this brilliant communist future. Tito Party Army. They changed that. By 1955, 1956, the government in Yugoslavia is talking about 3 very, very different things that were going to provide the glue to the society and create a kind of socialism with a human face, communism with a human face, the third path. These 3 things were the non-aligned movement in terms of foreign policy, workers' self-management in terms of economics, so not state capitalism, not forced collectivization, not a Stalinist or a Maoist version of this forced march into modernity. Worker self-management was supposed to be a new system of property ownership where you still had personal property. All the communist countries had personal property. You had a car and an oven and an apartment. This is talking about the property that Marx called social property, the property that makes money, in other words. So factories, businesses, enterprises of various types. Worker self-management was not just a call for workers to run those instead of a 5-year plan dictating everything from the center part of the central city of the country, but worker self-management meant that eventually everyone owned it and could share in the profits from individual enterprises. It was a very complicated system. It never really worked that well, but Yugoslavia kept afloat economically because since they weren't behind the Iron Curtain, Yugoslavs could travel. They worked in Germany as Gastarbeiter. They went all over the world as professors, Fulbrights. They went everywhere. I learned 2 or 3 languages at Indiana taught by Fulbright professors from the former Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavs were also allowed to have foreign currency bank accounts, and many of them used, if they worked in Germany as a mechanic or a factory worker, they would send their money back to Yugoslavia and build a weekend house up in the mountains. This was perfectly all right, and lots of people did it. So the system worked at the individual level. The third pillar of this newer Yugoslavia, Tito's kinder, gentler Yugoslavia, was supposed to be a federal solution to the nationalities problems. That's a long story, and that obviously did not work, but that's also not the most important thing for Jovanovich's works. Anyway, final point before we talk about the novels, in terms of Yugoslavia, what was its cultural situation like? What was its literary situation like? And who is Jovanovic to come tearing out of this unknown life? She's a 20-something young woman in Belgrade, and how does she manage to take the literary scene by storm? Well, Yugoslavia, and Serbia in particular, had actually all the Yugoslav republics in the 50s, 60s, and 70s had an extremely vibrant literary scene and an extremely vibrant cultural scene in general. There's a cool new book out if you're into sort of comparative cultural studies, etc. It's by CEU Press in Budapest and New York, and it's called Coca-Cola Socialism. It's a study of Yugoslav pop culture, everything from the musical Hair to bootleg Elvis and Beatles recordings, and to the first McDonald's, and all this stuff about how Yugoslavia managed to absorb a great deal of Western pop culture, but not necessarily political values that underlay or accompanied that culture. So Yugoslavia is open, okay? It's open to lots and lots of influences, but it also has this long-standing cultural tradition, and the written word and the sung word or the recited word in terms of epic poetry, oral poetry, goes back many centuries, 3, 4, 5 centuries in Serbian and other Western Balkan cultures. So Serbs tend to be called, I mean, this is a generalization, but it's a very positive one, and it's one I'll stand by. It's a very literate society. It's also, in many ways, a very literary society. So Belgrade, capital city of Yugoslavia, traditional capital of Serbia, Biljana's hometown, Belgrade used to be called the Paris of the Balkans from time to time. I know Bucharest thinks it is now, but and the reason Belgrade got this name, it was in the 1920s and 30s, because the poetry scene was so wild and woolly and crazy there. Serbs had a number of famous poets, famous all over Europe anyway, not in North America, who were surrealists, and they were all kinds of little artistic collectives who were doing experiments with print and with architecture and other things, kind of a smaller version of what had gone on in Russia just before the revolution, just before World War I, or the kinds of things that, yes, are always going on in Paris or Vienna, but it was happening in the Balkans. It was Serbian, and it really put Serbian culture on the map in terms of Europe. After World War II, those surrealist poets, many of them became communists and continued to write and publish. And nobody necessarily reads surrealistic poetry today, but this provided a really smooth transition for Serbian culture. The Serbs didn't find their cultural establishment purged after World War II. It was easy for them to adapt to the new communist system because many of them had been politically active and they were quite savvy about how to sort of balance their political commitments, etc. Also, after the mid-50s, Tito and the communists, they do crack down on a lot of bourgeois poets and whatnot in the first 10 years after World War II. But by the late 1950s, Tito is really downplaying the importance of censorship. He backs the Communist Party out of its leading role in society, and he says that he wants the Communist Party to be a guide. He even changes the name. The Communist Party changes its name in 1958 to the basically the Association of Communists for Yugoslavia. So to emphasize that the country is not going to be directly steered by communism. Was Yugoslavia free as a country? Not entirely, no. Could you leave if you wanted to? Usually, yes. Could people basically read what they wanted? Yes. There was a small amount of censorship. And one of the things, for instance, you could not write on, you could not belittle the partisan effort during World War II. And you could not make fun of or cast any negative light. You couldn't throw any shade on Tito himself as a person. But otherwise, you know, in the post-World War II period, you hear a lot, if you study communist countries, about socialist realism, this very strict dogma that every book and every movie had to promote the interests of the Communist Party, and it had to be easily intelligible so that even workers could understand the clear delineation between good guys and bad guys, and everything was supposed to relate to the class struggle, etc. Yugoslavia didn't have that. They had a policy they called socialist aestheticism, which was that literature should very vaguely, in an indirect way, assist the development of the country. And if you did that, you could get published. It is kind of amazing that Jovanovich's books got published. It's possible that, I do not know for sure, it's possible that they got published because, well, the first one got published because no one had heard of her. Maybe the second one got published because her parents were bigwigs and because she worked at an influential journal. There are people who say that she was an enfant terrible, Ms. Jovanovic, and that she was a child of communism, right? And that some people, I don't know, I think that makes her transition or her transformation into an oppositional figure even more interesting. Some people think it was just a destructive twitch of 1960s, 1970s radicalism that made her bite the hand that fed her, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Before we talk a little bit about these two books and maybe have some questions and answers, I see we're over halfway already. I think I'll do a little Serbian language with you. Would you like that? Would you like to learn a little Serbian? All right. So I've watched the People's University talks on Russian and on Japanese, so I modeled my vocabulary on that. It's a little more extensive than those. So let's go. All right, I'm gonna try to get this up for Sean to post here. I hope your tongues are limber. Can you roll your R's? Can you trill your R's? Serbs trill their R's like Spanish speakers. Application window. Okay, to the top. There we go. Basic Serbian phrases. So I don't know where you're going to use these. Maybe in Pittsburgh. Is there a Serbian restaurant in Pittsburgh? There didn't used to be, but maybe there is now. But maybe you'll have occasion, or if your grandma is Serbian, she'll be thrilled that you jotted these down. So the standard, easy, typical way to say hello is zdravo. Zdravo. There's that trilled R and a combination of 3 consonants right at the start. It's not as hard as Polish to pronounce, but some of these Slavic languages do have consonantal train wrecks, as we call them. Zdravo literally means health or healthy. And it's saying, I hope you're healthy. That's a nice greeting. I like that. Good morning. Dobro jutro. Dobro jutro. Dobro means good. Jutro means morning. You'll see the word dobro or some version of it in about half the phrases that we're doing here. If you know any other Slavic languages, if you remember your Russian from Ian's talk a few weeks ago, or if you know Polish or anything as a family language, you'll recognize a lot of these words. The Slavic languages are not mutually intelligible typically, but they are close. And parts of them are almost transferable, interoperable. Good day, so a glorified form of hello for anytime it's daylight, basically, anytime after 10 a.m. Dobar dan. Dobar dan. Good evening, which is what we would say about now if we ran into each other on the street. Dobro večer. Dobro večer. And then good night takes a different form altogether. It's wishing you, this literally says easy night. So and what's understood is, what's parenthetical, I wish you an easy night, a problem-free night. Laku noć. Laku noć. They have all kinds of other cute phrases too, like sweet dreams and all that kind of stuff, just like we do in English. How are you? There are many, many ways to say this. This is, you know, there are slangy ways to say what's up. And the phrase that you would use for how are you also depends on your social standing vis-a-vis the other person, whether you're on the intimate form or the formal form, or I guess informal or formal, this tu vu thing that a lot of languages have. Anyway, this is a standard one that won't get you in any trouble for saying it. How are you? Kako ste. Kako ste. Literally, how are. How are. Kako ste. Fine, thanks. Dobro. Hvala. Dobro. Hvala is the main word for thank you. Thank you. Hvala. You also see that same word in the next one here. Thank you very much. Hvala vam puno. Hvala vam puno. Literally, this means thank you to you fully. You know, direct translations make no sense, right? I'm just letting you know that there's an adverb at the end there. Thank you to you fully. Thank you very much. There are lots of ways to say that too. Please and you're welcome are the same word as they are in many continental languages. The most common way to say them, it's an easy 2-syllable addition to your vocabulary. Molim. Molim. You're welcome or please. So you can say it before and after the thank you very much comes your way. Molim. I hear everybody asking for beer in these People's University talks. Serbian beer's good, but Serbian wine is better, a lot better. I recommend the reds. So we'll go with this jocular idiom. Crveno vino molim. Crveno vino molim. 2 of those words you recognize. Vino you recognize, right? Because the Serbs borrowed it straight from their neighbors and friends, the Italians. Molim, you just learned. Lenny, please. And crveno is the adjective for red. Notice the consonantal cluster there at the beginning. Crv. There are words which have 5 and sometimes 6 letters with no vowel in between in Serbian. That said, R's in Serbian can serve as what we call a half vowel. And R is often preceded by a little sound, a schwa, as we would say in English. So actually what you're saying here is Crveno. It's like TS with a schwa and then the R. So it's actually not as hard to pronounce as it might look. So we'll go on over to page 2. Goodbye, which you'll be saying to me very soon. Do viđenja. Do viđenja. Very, very similar to that famous Russian phrase, do svidaniya. They both mean the same thing. Until we see each other again, like au revoir in French, right? Until we see each other again. Koliko to košta. How much does this cost? Or that, same word in Serbian. How much does this cost? Koliko to košta. I put this one in there so you could see this verb košta, koštati, which is the verb to cost, which sounds and looks almost like English or like a lot of the Latinate languages, because Serbian is in our language family. It's in the Indo-European family, like all the other Slavic languages. And there are a lot of cognates. There are a lot of words you recognize in Serbian. Volim te. I love you. Volim te. Te means you. Not surprisingly, if you know other European languages, you might recognize that pronoun. So if you can't say volim te, maybe you will need to say, I think I love you. Depending on what kind of trip you're on. Mislim da te volim. Mislim da te volim. I think that you I love. That's literally what that means. I think that you I love. Mislim da te volim. And if you can't even say that, but you feel like you need to say something, then you can say the next one. Maybe I love you. Možda volim te. Možda means maybe. Literally, it means it could be. It could be that I love you. Možda volim te. Now, turning to phrases to round this out of more general utility. This place is cool, whether it's a museum or a town, or you're visiting Fargo for the first time, and you say, Ovo mesto je sjajno. Ovo mesto je sjajno. And that is literally word for word the same as the English. This place is cool, exclamation point. Serbian's not the hardest language I've ever learned. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful language. It's a lot of fun. It has a lot of vowels in it sometimes, not always. But this next phrase, it is raining, is an example of how the vowel patterns can set up in Serbian sentences. And sometimes you just pop along. You feel like you're speaking Italian. It's Balkan Italian. What do you know? It's not related to Italian closely, but it sounds like it sometimes. Kisha pada. Kisha pada. It's raining. Kisha is rain. Pada is falling. It is falling. It is snowing. A phrase, well, I remember it snowing plenty in Wheeling in the old days. Certainly snows a little bit where I live now. Sneg pada. Sneg pada. Here's a phrase we all have in common. This time of year, this year especially, it's hot. It's hot. Vruće je. Vruće je. And then 2 jocular sentences to round this out. Dang, this is expensive. Blagi Bože, to je skupo. Blagi Bože means like, good Lord, good grief. Most Serbs would not say good Lord or good grief. They would use a word of the sort that Sean doesn't want me to use in this talk, so I didn't give you that version. This is the sweet elementary school suitable version. Blagi Bože literally means basically, well, my sweet Lord. Good grief, good Lord. Dang, this is to je skupo. Skupo is expensive. And then something you're more likely to say, because Serbia is a bargain for American visitors. This is unbelievably inexpensive. This is unbelievably inexpensive. To je neverovatno jeftino. To je Neverovatno, improbably, jeftino. Jeftino is their word for cheap or inexpensive. And it's an old Turkish word. Like one of the things that separates Serbian from some of its neighbors, especially the Croatian language, which is very closely related and has been for a long time. Sometimes they've even been classified together as a common language with two variants. But Serbian uses a lot of Turkicisms, words, especially for household things, weather phenomena, crops, natural things that they got from the Turks, coming from living under the Turks for all those centuries. All right, that's a little Serbian, so we can stop with that now. Let's see. Thank you, Sean. How are we doing out there? Oh, I see some friends of mine from Raleigh, North Carolina, or nearby have also tuned in. That's remarkable. So I think it's time we talked a little bit about, yes, I'm in the progressive West. Let's talk a little bit about Jovanovich's books. I mean, we could talk about her political activism, but this is supposed to be mostly a literary talk. I found out about her by accident. I've been translating literary things, literary fiction, for almost exactly 2 decades. I had all these languages. There weren't enough good books in print for my students to use. At the 2 universities I've taught at, I've always wanted them to have more access to cool stuff from East European culture, not just the same old books about the same old wars by the same old men. Sorry, but a lot of it's great literature, but there's a lack. There's a lack of diversity. And then 9/11 happened, and there were a number of publishing initiatives aimed at helping the U.S. Try to understand the world and maintain good relations with other parts of the world, despite our new war on terrorism, etc. And I started getting some translations published. I've now done 15 books of translation. 14 of them were novels from various languages. I've done a lot of shorter things, obviously, short stories and a little bit of poetry, not much. But I worked for a number of years. I did 6 volumes by a fantastic Serbian writer named Danilo Kiš. K-I-S, Danilo Kiš. Some of you have been given copies of some of those books by me. I worked on Kiš's stuff for about a decade. He was a fantastic, I think, to my mind, he was the greatest writer from the Balkans ever, in any epoch, from any school of writing, any genre, any country. Kiš died, and like Yovanovich, he died very young, in 1980 from in 1989 from cancer. And he had a number of books already in English translation, but I did basically the rest of his books that I could get access to. So I did 6 books of Kiš, and after I finished with Kiš, I was thinking, wow, this avocation part of my Balkan obsession is going very well. I need to find somebody new to translate. Well, I'm not a professional translator, so I don't have to worry about what's going to sell. It's easier to get a publisher's attention if they think the book's going to sell, obviously. But I'm not looking for the latest great person who does book tours and signings. And there are lots of great translators who work with lots of great writers. I wanted to pick people who were historically significant in ways that reflect how I teach history and how I try to construct the historical narrative to reach North American college students, and that help me understand the Balkans, and that I think people would benefit by having access to in the Anglosphere, whatever that means. So I came across a reference to this Biljana Jovanovic in an article, and in an article on Balkan nationalism. But I don't want to be a professional translator, responding to one of your questions, because, well, I'm a professional historian who also translates. But thank you. So there was this reference to Biljana Jovanovic being a highly innovative writer of the late 70s and 80s, whose works ended up being very pro-peace, very anti-nationalist, very pro-feminist. And she went from being a kind of cult writer or enfant terrible in the 70s and early 80s to being now still highly regarded and considered one of those people you call a writer's writer. Two of her 3 novels are still for sale in these new editions in Belgrade. You see them everywhere. And people talk about her. They talk about her as much as an activist as they do about her as a writer. But there haven't been any films made of her books. That would be very, very difficult to do. She has nothing on YouTube. I mean, she dies in 96. There must have been recordings of her. I have asked people at radio TV stations across Belgrade, the archives. I've asked everybody. I've asked her friends. I met her sister, and nobody knows of any recordings of her. I can't find any moving picture footage of her. It would be really cool to see how she lived and operated, because lots of people, tons of people, every year at the anniversary of her passing, people write in about memories of what it was like to work with Biljana. And also, since I know her second husband, he told me a great deal about her. So there is also a literary prize today named in her honor. I've been invited to talk at this year's awards ceremony. It's supposed to coincide with the time when I'll be in Belgrade. If things, we'll see if COVID-19 allows any of this to happen. But so she's still extremely famous in literary circles and in political circles. But her works are difficult. So when I find that reference to her in this article, I immediately interlibrary loaned. Here's to all the librarians out there. Interlibrary loan is one of the greatest aspects of any modern library, right? Thank you, everybody. All those decades of ILLs that I've kept past their due date. Your diligence in finding these obscure materials is invaluable. It's indispensable. I got all 3 of the books interlibrary loan, read them, found them fascinating, as well as poignant, heart-rending, disturbing, and in some cases hilarious. And mostly as a historian, extremely illuminating about what daily life was like for young people in the socialist metropolis of Belgrade. You don't hear a lot about this, right? And I thought, dang. So then I bought all 3 of the books over the interweb, and then I set about asking scholars and friends in Belgrade, do you think this would be a worthy topic? And then next thing you know, I'm exchanging emails with her widower, and then off we go to the races. The most important book I have ever translated in my life is this one. To those of you who have selected it for reading groups or whatever, a couple of my friends have, I am grateful. It is the most important book I have ever translated in terms of how it declares war on modern society. It is a screaming cry of agony for change in a society, based mostly because of the sexual harassment and sexual abuse, but also because of the inadequate medical system, suicides that go unprevented when it didn't have to happen that way, and some really horrific, sad things happen to the family in Belgrade in this book. And less important than that assertion of mine, this is the most difficult book I have ever translated, the second one by her. In some ways, the 2 books are similar. They both have a protagonist who is a young woman in her 20s living in Belgrade with university credentials, so somebody from the humanities, but you don't hear a lot about what they study. But this second one, this one, first one, Dogs and Others, is written in a kind of stream of consciousness, kind of a lot of interior monologue, a lot of jumbly plot elements out of sequence. This one is written with all of those characteristics, but also written in slang, very 1970s-ish, Belgrade-ish slang, and I had to rely on my friends in Belgrade for a lot of individual words that I couldn't track down in any of my dictionaries or Ask Jeeves or anything like that. All right. Well, in the time that we have remaining, I think I will read a brief summary of each of the books. How about that? And then if there's time, I'll read a passage for you. But I just want to read. I wrote essays for each of these that are in the volumes to sort of explain and contextualize them. So I think this will give you an idea of what Yovanovich writes about. Okay. Okay, so this is Avila Is Falling, the story of a young flutist in Belgrade. This is written in 1978, published to grade. This became the cult novel. This was her breakout novel, Biljana Jovanovic. This novel, this is me writing about the book. This novel lumbers through the life of a young university student in Belgrade named Jelena Belovic. She studies flute at the Academy, a state conservatory, although aside from a few mentions of instruction, rehearsal, and concert appearances, we would barely know it. References to culture, high and popular, abound, as do mentions of cultural institutions, associations, and infrastructure. Jelena's life in Belgrade is subdivided or demarcated by several axes: chronological, erotic, and spatial. Her living situation, for instance, with Mariana, by herself, with Vladica, and with her aunt Masha. The narrator for the bulk of the book is Jelena herself. Other guiding voices include her anonymous would-be male lover, who fancies himself her biographer, and who might actually be some facet of her. She has a doppelganger in this book. She has a double, and you're never quite sure which one is being referred to or which one is actually talking. He has his hand on several chapters. There's a person called the Lookout, who is an anonymous observer and creeper of, again, arguable provenance. There's Martin, a conductor. Vladica, her collegial husband. She has a friendly marriage, platonic marriage with someone, so for financial reasons for him. And possibly Jelena's fictitious Siamese twin. That's her doppelganger. Many of the characters appear in the novel as Jelena's sexual partners. All but one, Mariana, are male. All but one, Bautista von Chauvin, are products of Jovanovich's imagination. This Chilean was a real historical figure, although he died before the time of the novel. Jelena's other lovers include Mr. Swede the mustache, Vladica, the peripatetic perpetual student, Mitsa, an army officer in training, Petar Martinovic, the secretary of her apartment building's tenants council, Vladimir Ristic, a sketchy chess player, Martin, her conductor, and probably Sala, a waiter. The novel is set in Belgrade and Inverans, a bunch of suburbs, with one sequence described in Jelena's second letter, somewhere in Western Europe. This is for sure in a ferry boat crossing the English Channel. A few other hitchhiking scenes are harder to pin down. There are also references to coastal Montenegro and Croatia, to Chile, and to mountainous South Asia. As in both of her other published novels, there are many specific references to streets, buildings, restaurants, and other places in the city of Belgrade. Blah, blah, blah. I'm going off on a tangent there. So many of the 15 chapters of this book zero in on one of Jelena's relationships. There are numerous internal monologues, but also outright digressions, some of them hefty. References to psychological illness and mental health institutions abound. Jelena is dissatisfied with her relationships with men, some of which are violent. She yearns tempestuously for Mariana, who is at one time her rival and her muse, a dear friend and a moving target. Her aunt, from the redoubt of family seniority and apartment ownership, who cuts her to the quick often, but is herself a pitiable figure. Two of Jelena's lovers in particular, Mr. Swede the mustache and her husband of convenience, Vladica, are particularly nauseating as lovers. Ultimately, the plot hinges on scattered attempts to answer one question for the reader. Now, this is really the crux of the book. She disappears during this book, and nobody knows where she is, and we do not know when we finish the book. You know, it's postmodern. Before that was an everyday word. There are multiple endings, if you will, to this book, sort of coded into it. What happened to Ms. Belovic? After rolling through these months in the Yugoslav capital in the mid to late 1970s, Jelena has either gone to England and off of our radar, been murdered in Greater Belgrade because of some newspaper articles that have been reproduced in the book, is hiding out with one of her lovers, also in Greater Belgrade, or is dying in a hateful pharma-soaked sanatorium, the same one where she experiences phantasmagoric dream sequences or delusions, or is even transformed into her mother, who met a disastrous end there in the 1950s. Whew! Yes, that's what this is about. It is a plot with many branches and polyphonic presentation of ideas, and not a clear resolution. This book is, I have a little bit of time still, so I'm going to just read you a brief summary of this book, her second one, because this is even more political in a lot of ways. It tells us more about late Yugoslavia, I think. This novel, so this is Dogs and Others, published in 1980. This novel is a quest. It is built of a spare plot, much enriched by flashbacks and letters of various types. The glue that holds its pieces together is a particular epistemology, more or less articulated in variously barely disguised authorial interventions sprinkled throughout the text, along with a pell-mell, take-no-prisoners style of narration that is well-suited to capture the tumult of Lydia's life and surroundings. Lydia is the 20-something female protagonist in this book. This is Yovanovich's second novel. And it is, to say the least, highly unconventional. Avant-garde is a better characterization. It is set in Belgrade in the 1960s and 1970s, and through a fragmentary narrative, replete with intertextuality and interior monologues, it tracks the life of a young woman named Lydia. The lives depicted in the novel are probably more countercultural than bohemian per se, because none of them are really artists or really successful at anything, but they're all kind of living off the grid, these recent college graduates, and are involved in everything from selling drugs to pornography to, well, I mean, there are many, many unseemly things that go on in this novel, and most of them in the context of a family, especially involving her abusive and often absent mother, Marina. The lives depicted in the novel are probably more countercultural than bohemian, but above all, they are modern and urban. Lydia's family life is pulling apart at the seams due to old age, disability, mental illness, drug use, and suicide. Her very personhood is also bedeviled by memories of an abusive childhood that are still very much alive, but also by sexism, sexual harassment, and sexual assault in her adult world. Lydia is raped by her psychiatrist and sexually assaulted by her boss. Her lover, Milena, is assaulted by her dentist and, in turn, sexually assaults an intellectually disabled patient in her care. A kind of frame tale is set up in the first chapter with the narrator and her grandmother, Jaglika, positioned to contemplate each other's stories about the history of the family. So I won't keep reading that. The novel doesn't have anything dramatic going on like the first one where the protagonist disappears, but I guess you would say the climax of Dogs and Others is the suicide of the narrator's brother, which mirrors the suicide of their father a decade before, and then there are constant flashbacks throughout the novel to how these two young Belgrade 20-somethings were raised, and what a strange family life they had, and how the system has completely failed them. All right, that's why that's what I've been doing in my spare time, translating these things, and I would love to hear questions. You might want to ask me, why the hell do I waste my time doing this? Or how does this connect to other stuff? Or if you just like to talk about Yugoslavia, the late great, as I like to call it, I'm happy. I'm at your disposal. Are there questions? If you're looking from North Carolina, you might want to see this cup. Okay. Oh, would you like for me to read a passage in Serbian and then read its English equivalent? I can do that. I can do that. Let's see. I'm going to do that. Okay. I will read you a brief passage from Dogs and Others about the grandmother. Lydia's grandmother is named Jaglika. And in all three of Jovanovich's novels, it's really cool. There's a lot of intergenerational family connection. There are a lot of intergenerational family connections that abide and are nurtured and provide some antidote or alternative to the craziness of society. There's also, and this is strange for a child of the red bourgeoisie or for an anarchist, like many people say that Yovanovich was, there's also a quiet but pretty unshakable respect for religion, not for hierarchies and dogmas and institutions and buildings and incense, but for belief and for faith. Kind of a distant echo of my love of Graham Greene from those Wheeling Jesuit days. But okay, you want to hear some Serbian? Here we go. This is Serbian the way Biljana wrote it. Jaglika se danima obračunavala šapatom, čas sa Bogom, za koga je vjerovala da je sve moguće i savršeno biće, čas sa đavolom. Nije prestajala da govori i jednom i drugom. Ja nikom ništa nisam učinila na žal, ja sam svoja pošteno odužila. A Danilo je smejao i trčkarao oko, nije zadevajući je, skrivajući čas štap, čas naočare, čas novine, ali nepotrebno. Jaglika je prestala da traži naočare, novine, štap, bilo šta. Malo je spavala, ni malo jela i zahtevala, baš zahtevala da ide kući. Danila je povremeno nazivala imenom našeg oca, Marinino ime je zamenila imenom svoje sestre, mene uopšte nije oslovljavala nikako izuzev ona. Ili pak ova, što je bilo jedno te isto. So what that says in English is, according to this crazy translation I found, Jaglika settled her accounts. Jaglika, the matriarch of the family, is dying and is being brutally ignored by most and exploited by most of the family members. Jaglika settled her accounts in a whisper for days on end, at times with God, whom she believed to be an omnipotent and perfect being, and at other times with the devil. She never ceased holding conversations with the one and the other. I never did anything to hurt anyone, and I always paid back my debts. And Danilo laughed while bustling around her, teasing her by hiding first her cane and then her glasses and then her newspaper. But there was no point. Jaglika had ceased looking for her spectacles, her paper, her cane, or anything else. She slept little, ate nothing at all really, and straight out demanded to go home. Sometimes she called Danilo by our father's name. She mixed up Marina's name with that of her own sister. And as for me, she didn't address me at all except with her or this one, which was the same thing. What else can we work on? Does anybody know the name of any other Yugoslav writers? They'll be male, all of them. Some of them are fantastic. Danilo Kish is fantastic. In 1961, a Serb won the Nobel Prize for Literature, the only person from the territory of Yugoslavia ever to win the Nobel for Literature, though there have been many scientists who won it. Yes, I'll talk about the languages in just a second. Ivo Andrić is his name, and I'm going to suggest another book or two to the librarians there. Sean has put up a wonderful list of historical reference works and samples of fiction from the Western Balkans. But Ivo Andrić is definitely the most famous Yugoslav writer for most people. Oh, Julia and Aaron did that. Okay, thank you to your colleagues then, Mr. Duffy. He wrote a famous book called The Bridge on the Drina, which is a wonderful introduction to Balkan history and culture. But if you have any other Yugoslav writers you'd like me to talk about, I could. But I will mention languages. So I've been referring this whole hour to Serbian. I speak Serbian. When I'm in Croatia, I don't walk around saying I speak Serbian. I say I speak Croatian. Am I lying? No, not really. In 1987, when I started graduate school at Indiana, I signed up for a course called Serbo-Croatian. That was when Yugoslavia still existed as a country, and when in Yugoslavia, Serbo-Croatian, or its equally valid equivalent, Croato-Serbian, was considered one of the national languages of the country. The country breaks up starting in 91. The country has death spasms and rattles, and it doesn't ultimately disappear completely as a formulation of some of the successor states until 2008, but Yugoslavia is now definitively gone. And there was never a language called Yugoslavian, right? It was Serbo-Croatian plus Slovene plus Macedonian and some other languages. But Serbo-Croatian is now broken up into 4 languages: Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin. It broke up not because writers wanted it broken up or because ordinary people wanted it broken up. Linguists certainly did not want to break it up. It was broken up by politicians, but also by legislators. So these languages have now been declared the official languages of these 4 post-Yugoslav countries. So, you know, we in the West who study Yugoslavia, or we outside the region who study it, we can't very well insist on calling their language something for our convenience, right? That would be an Orientalist fallacy. So we call it Serbian, or we call it whatever the people we're with call it. But there is a kind of new collective term that has emerged. And I love this because it puts the 4 successor languages in alphabetical order by their English translations to avoid any appearance of favoritism. So I wouldn't put this on my resume or CV because probably no one would understand it unless they're in the trade. But when we Balkan people are talking with each other, we refer to it as BCMS. The ugliest name for a language ever. BCMS. Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian. Montenegrin and Serbian can use either the Latin alphabet or the Cyrillic alphabet. Croatian and Bosnian use the Latin alphabet, modified Latin alphabet with diacritical marks and some funky letters, right? Most people would say that these 4 languages are more similar than British and American English. Now, I'm not a linguist, but obviously I speak it, and I've traveled to all these places. Well, there's no problem with communication. Can they be separate languages still? Well, sure. I mean, the designation is a human one. It's a voluntaristic one. I don't lose any sleep over the fact that Serbo-Croatian doesn't exist, or that we have to call it BCMS. That seems like a minor adjustment to make compared to the changes in people's lives that have happened there since 1991 and things that they've gone through. So it's just a name. However, there are cultural forces in each of the countries that would like to drive the languages ever further apart to sort of copper fasten their own identity and their sense of distinctiveness, or maybe sometimes in the Croatian case that they're not even a Balkan people after all, they're purely a Central European people. Those are arguments for historians. Let them argue with that. I will say that there are differences that are easily recognizable between the 4, but there's not just an overlap in terms of the standard language. There are dialects that cross all of these sort of imagined borders also. And so nailing down exactly where someone came from on the basis of what they claim their official language to be, it's actually trickier than you might think. So I speak the Serbian variant, but people in a Croatian restaurant shop, we had a Bosnian restaurant here in Fargo for a number of years. They used to think I spoke Bosnian, and I just said, yeah, sure, I do. Let's see, a question came in about translation. Hello, Mitch Pittman. We have West Coast viewers too. This is awesome. Translation must be an incredibly subjective art form. How do I choose words and give the overall intended feeling? Well, it is subjective. It is subjective. One thing that you have to do as a literary translator is read the entire book before you translate any of it. And I think it really helps. Not everyone can do this. Not everyone has time or opportunity to do this. But if you can become something of a connoisseur of that particular writer before you translate her or him, that's a start, because you get into their mental world and you think of what their ideas are that they might have expressed in reviews or essays that help you make sense of the text. What you don't want to do is translate it in a way that's just you talking through them, right? Because that's not what people are paying for. They want to hear Yovanovich, not Cox, in this book. That said, there will remain always subjectivity. I think in the passage that I read, y'all, I referred to naučara in Serbian once as glasses and once as spectacles. I did that on purpose. I'm not sure in translation theory what that's called, synonym substitution. I don't know. I do that to reflect in part the richness of English, because Serbian does not have as many words as English. And, I realize there can be a difference between spectacles and glasses, just like if you got into sunglasses or eyepieces or other things like, there are shades of meaning. But there are times when you can just play with synonyms. It's harmless, and it adds bubbles to your mineral water. But above all, as I'm saying, I think you have to get into the mental world of the author and try to create an authentic work that is rooted where it ought to be, which is in their society, right? You don't, as a translator, you don't say, okay, this is set in Belgrade. Belgrade's hard for Americans to pronounce, so I'm going to set this in Newark or in Gary, Indiana, industrial towns, and we'll just do it there, and we'll just Americanize it. No, then that's a different book, right? It has to be rooted in the place where it was written and the people for whom it was written. But you have to try to achieve, with individual words and phrases, you have to go for what I call equivalent effect. Like when in the list of vocabulary, when I said, oh my gosh, this is expensive, right? Serbs would not say, oh my gosh. But to a Serb, the F word that they would use in that particular case, I mean, you wouldn't say it to your grandmother, but you're not going to get thrown out of class for saying it either. Whereas we drop the F-bomb and it's like, right? Unless you're under 20. But the point is, if I did that as the F-bomb in English translation, the effect that it produces on a North American reader would be radically different than the effect that it would produce on a Serbian reader. So I try to go for equivalent effect. Equivalent effect. Blagi Bože, writes someone. Good. Oh, and why am I better than Google Translate? Try it out sometime. Try it out sometime. Rhythm and diction and slang, and there are all kinds of things that Google Translate can't do. Plus, Google Translate has never read the rest of Biljana Jovanovic. Huh? These are great questions. Any other questions? Sean, you just tell us when we're supposed to stop, okay?
Okay, I'll jump in here, John. Fantastic job. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
You did great. Seriously. Um, I just wanted to say that don't miss next week, because Father Alfred will do a fantastic job. We're going to Nigeria next, and it'll be good. Ochibe, Ochibe. And thank you again, John.
My pleasure. Good night, Wheeling, and West Coast and North Carolina for tuning in, and Fargo. Yes. All right.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.